All right, so now we're talking about muscle tension. And so muscle tension is where the muscle fiber is shortening, okay? That gives your muscles muscle tension. Now at rest, your muscles have a little tone to them, right? You have muscle tone, and that's because some of the fibers are contracted already in your muscle. They're always contracted, even at rest, and that gives you muscle tone. So the neuron is constantly sending signals to some of those muscle fibers telling them to contract, right? When we look at the muscle, so here on this picture we're showing, this is like a muscle right here, okay? So there's the muscle, and these are the muscle fibers. Each one of these things are muscle fibers. And you can see that they're in different colors. I put them in different colors, green, red, blue. So all of the red ones are being controlled by one neuron. So that one neuron and the muscle fibers it controls is called a motor unit. Then there's going to be another neuron that's going to control all the blue ones. And there will be another motor neuron that's going to control all those green ones. And so that way your muscle is going to, they're going to kind of share responsibility on giving that muscle its tone. At some times, at some points, the red neuron will be sending action potentials, and all of those red ones that I have up there, those red muscle fibers will contract, and that's giving the muscle tone. But then that neuron will rest, and another neuron will start sending a signal and will cause the blue ones to shorten. So you have this constant muscle tone without getting fatigue, and so your body should have, your muscles should have muscle tone. If there's been a damage to the spinal cord, which is right here, or if there's damage to the neurons themselves, now you're not going to get any muscle tone, and a person will have what we call flaccid muscle tone, where there's just nothing there. It's mushy, and there's no tone to it. Okay? So muscles have to have this, it has to have neural stimulation. It has to have ACH being released from the neuron in order to contract. All right, so, and the definition of the muscle, this muscle or motor unit is the neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it communicates with or that it innervates. Okay? And like we said, muscle tone. In skeletal muscles, some motor units are always active even when the muscle is at rest or not contracting. And that's called muscle tone. So when you decide you want to contract your muscle, like you want to move, you want to you bend your joints, you want to contract those muscles, then you're going to recruit more motor units until you get the right amount of muscle tension, until there's the right amount of muscle fiber contracting to do what you need to do whatever it is that you want to do. Okay? All right, now there are different types of contractions, so we want to go over these. These are important, pretty important if you're going into like physical therapy or PTA, physical therapy assistant, right? So you want to know these different types of contractions. So we have either an isotonic contraction or an isometric contraction. In an isotonic contraction, that means that the muscle changes length. It's going to either get shorter or longer. But it's contracting, it's creating tension. The sarcomeres are trying to shorten, right? The sarcomeres are sliding those filaments towards the M line. And then we have an isometric contraction, and this is where the muscle doesn't change length. Okay, the muscle does not change length. So let's look at some examples. Let's start with the isometric. Here we see that she is standing there and she just has her arm out to the front and she's not moving it at all. Are muscles contracting? Yeah, they have to be contracting or her arm would drop. Are they changing length at all? No, they're just, there's tone in there, there's tension in there because the muscles are contracting and keeping it in that one position. But they're not shortening, they're not lengthening. I mean, they had to shorten or lengthen to get to this position, but once they're there, they're not shortening, they're not lengthening. So that's an isometric contraction. So, you know, doing those wall sits that your coach always made you do, that's an isometric contraction, right? Muscles are contracting, but there's no movement. Then we look at isotonic. So isotonic contractions can either be concentric or eccentric. Concentric means that the muscle shortens. Eccentric means that the muscle lengthens. All right, so let's look at concentric. So here in this example, he is he's contracting his bicep muscle and bringing his forearm up. So when he's doing that, the biceps brachii muscle is attached to the forearm and it's pulling it up. And the muscle has to shorten in order to do that. So the biceps brachii is shortening. That's a concentric isotonic contraction. Okay? But now in the second picture, which is eccentric and or eccentric, and he is lengthening that arm, now he's going from here and he's opening that elbow joint up, extending that elbow. The muscle is still contracting because he's doing it slowly and controlled. He's not just flopping it down. It's a slow, controlled movement. The bicep muscle still has to contract. The filaments are still sliding, but now the muscle itself, the whole muscle is lengthening. But you're still getting a contraction. You're still getting tension in there. If you didn't control that and didn't have tension, your arm would just drop because there'd be no tension. So eccentric, they use this a lot in physical therapy, right? They use eccentric. It's usually it's a good one. So when you have your arms on a bar and you are pulling that bar down, you're strengthening your biceps brachii muscle because you're making them contract, and at the same time you're lengthening them, right? So when you're pulling that down, you're doing an eccentric contraction. If you were to take little dumbbells and you were lifting them up like this, now you're shortening the bicep muscle, so that's going to be concentric. Right? That's concentric because you're shortening them. Okay? So that's the difference between those different types of contractions. Now we also have, I've been talking about these muscle cells, which we call muscle fibers. And so far I've just been talking about them as though there's only one type of muscle fiber. There's actually there's three different types. I'm going to talk about two of the types. One's an intermediate type. I'm going to talk about the slow fibers and the fast fibers, right? So all of your muscles have a combination of slow fibers and fast fibers. So the slow fibers, when we look at those, they have a smaller diameter. So each one of those muscle fibers or muscle cells has a smaller diameter. They have a dark color. So they have what is called myoglobin, and myoglobin is a molecule that can store oxygen. So these muscle fibers are going to be darker, right? They're going to be darker in color, and they have a smaller diameter. Because they have such a great storage of oxygen, those muscle fibers are resistant to fatigue because oxygen helps us to make ATP. So as long as the muscle has a constant supply of ATP, it's going to be able to continually contract. So your muscles in your body are going to have a combination of slow fibers and fast fibers, but some of the muscles are going to have more slow fibers. So the muscles for posture are going to have more slow fibers than they are fast fibers. So this is showing your gastrocnemius. That allows you to stand for a long, long, long time, right? Slow fibers, they're slow to fatigue. They've got myoglobin, they look darker, okay? Then we have the fast fibers, and the fast fibers have a larger diameter, so they're going to be bigger diameter, okay? And they're not going to have the myoglobin, so they're going to be real pale. Now, because they don't have the myoglobin, they're going to fatigue very easily. But because they're so big, they're going to be able to contract very strongly. So we get strong contractions that fatigue out very fast. Okay. So like the muscle fibers in your eye, you know, you can move your eye very fast, right? Very fast, but they're going to fatigue out after a while if you try to do that. I mean, don't try to do that, but if you tried to do that, they would fatigue very quickly. Within 30 seconds, you'd be like, I'm done. I can't keep, you know, you wouldn't be able to keep doing that. Your quadriceps, those are muscles too. They give you a tremendous amount of power, right? So that's why, you know, guys can dunk the basketball, and women, you know, men and women can sprint so fast, you know, that 100-meter sprint, but then boom, they're done. That they fatigue out easily, right? So those are the fast fibers then. They're pale, they fatigue easily, they have a larger diameter, right? So if we were to compare this, like I said, these muscles in your body, they're a combination of fast and slow and intermediate fibers, but they're always going to have some, you know, they're going to have more of one than the other. And the other thing is you can train, and you can train your muscles, you can train these fast fibers to act more like slow fibers. So there is a way to train for that in athletic training. Okay. If we were to look at an animal like a chicken, okay, chicken, like the chicken legs, those chicken legs have all slow fibers. So when a chicken is trying to get away from a predator, it's going to do two things. First, it's going to try to fly, but it's not going to be able to fly very far, and it's using its breast muscles. But then it'll try to run, and it can run and run and run and run for a long time, because those chicken legs they contain all slow fibers, and that is that dark meat, right? It's the dark meat that we see in the chicken. That's because it has myoglobin, right? The first thing that chicken wants to do, though, is try to fly away, and so the breasts on the chicken, which control the wings, which will give it a little bit of lift so it can fly a short distance, those breasts contain all fast fibers. So larger diameter, much more power, so they can immediately get away from their predator, but then they got to use those legs because they're going to fatigue out and they're not going to be able to fly, right? And that's the white meat, so it's pale because it doesn't have the myoglobin to make it dark. Right? Okay, so that's to show you an example of that. So chapter 11, the majority of chapter 11 is just identifying the muscles, and we've been doing that in lab. But for the lecture portion of it, there's a good portion of it that I'm not having you learn for this class, like the shape of the muscle or the different kind of levers that the muscle creates. We're going to just look at a few things here. So first we're going to look at the origin and insertion of muscles. And in our class, we don't have to name the origin and insertion of the muscles that we're studying, which is good, but you have to know the definition of origin and insertion. So origin is so the muscle's going to attach on both sides, first of all. You've got this long muscle, and you've got one side with tendons, and you have the other side with tendons. They're going to attach to two separate bones, because muscles are going to move bones. So one of the bones where it's attached to is not going to move, and the other bone where it's attached to is going to move. So you're going to get movement, right? So the origin of the muscle then, we can usually say is going to be the place where that tendon inserts that's more medial or more proximal. We can also say that the origin of the muscle is on the bone that doesn't move, right? So I'll go back and explain this again in just a second. The insertion then is the other end of the muscle, and that's on the bone that is more lateral or more distal. So that's the insertion. That is the part of the muscle. That muscle will be on the bone that's more lateral or more distal. And we can also say the insertion is going to be on the bone that moves. So if we look at the biceps brachii, okay? The origin is going to be up here on the scapula. And then the insertion is going to be way down here in the forearm. So when you're flexing your elbow like that, what is moving? It's the forearm that's moving. So it's the insertion. The insertion is on the bone that's moving, and it's more distal. The origin is on the bone that's more proximal, and it's not moving, right? So that's origin and insertion. Okay. Then we have these other terms for muscles. Some muscles will be termed an agonist, some will be termed a synergist, and some will be termed an antagonist. And that's just describing, those terms are just describing which is the muscle that's doing the majority of the work, which one's the helper, and which one's opposing the action, okay? So the agonist we call the prime mover, and it's basically the muscle to move a bone. It's the main muscle that moves the bone. So again, in elbow flexion, it's going to be the biceps brachii. That's going to be the agonist, okay? The synergist is the muscle that assists the prime mover, or in other words, helps the agonist. And what's that muscle underneath the biceps brachii? The brachialis. So the brachialis is the synergist. It's the synergist, and it helps the bicep brachii create elbow flexion. Okay, then the last one we have is an antagonist, and the antagonist opposes the agonist, or in other words, it performs the opposite movement of the agonist. So what's the opposite movement of elbow flexion? Extension. Elbow extension. So what is the muscle that's going to extend the elbow? The triceps brachii, right? The triceps brachii. Now, these terms, agonist, synergist, antagonist, they always have to go along with the action. Because in elbow flexion, the biceps brachii is the agonist, and the triceps is the antagonist. But what about in tricep, what about elbow extension? Now what's the agonist? The tricep is the agonist, and what's the antagonist? The biceps is the antagonist. All right, so let's take a look down here. It depends on the movement. Here we have elbow flexion. Here's the origin of the biceps brachii. Here's the insertion. It's pulling the forearm towards the shoulder. So in elbow flexion, the agonist is the biceps brachii. The synergist is the brachialis, which is right underneath it. It's a smaller muscle assisting it. And the antagonist is the triceps muscle. But if we look at elbow extension, this is where we're extending the elbow. The agonist, now, you're using the triceps to do that elbow extension. The agonist is the triceps brachii, and the antagonist, the one that is opposing it, would then be the biceps brachii. So it depends on what action you're doing. What action is the muscle doing, right? Okay.